is Sangha. I am a recent PhD graduate from University College Dublin in Ireland. And before then, I did 2 master's degrees and an undergraduate degree as well. So I have a lot of education behind me. But I should have dropped out of education a long time ago, the way education was presented to me. I knew that I wasn't normal. I learned differently. I always asked questions about why things were the way they were and how things connected. So I was always looking for that bigger picture. And I had a hard time memorizing things. But all that was expected of me was to memorize a bunch of subjects just for the purpose of writing examinations, which had virtually no relevance once they were over. Perhaps only to determine whether I could climb that next rung up the career ladder. And I think many of you can relate to that. So I always kept looking for that alternative pathway that would work for me much better. And as a result, my career has looked something like this, rather than that most people would aspire to. Now, I come from a family of very highly educated people. I had a great-grandfather who was trained in the medical sciences sometime in the 1920s. I had a grandfather who was a scientist and a father who was an engineer. And very importantly, I had a grandmother who went to college when many women couldn't. So I knew that if I dropped out of education, I would have let all those people down. And really, dropping out of school wasn't an option for me. But that quest to find better ways to educate ourselves never left me to this day, although I continued on to further education. I also didn't come from a very rich family. So in a way, my options were limited. So I couldn't travel far away from home. I couldn't take certain degrees or attend certain colleges. So I decided to take an economics program at a local college because it was considered a relatively safe career choice and would guarantee some kind of job for me at some point. And also it carried with it an amount of prestige that suited me as a good student. So I thought at the time it was a good option. And to start with, I was very happily settled in and perhaps even a bit distracted with adulting and all the other attractions of college life. But with time, I realized that we weren't really aligned, and I started to get a little bit restless and disheartened, and I wondered whether I had made the right career choice. So one of the first things that struck me was that although economics had been sold to me as the study of scarce resources, there was hardly any mention of the limits of our planet. And most models I studied were based on, say, averages, with no regard for the nuances of people or of place. And I also had friends who were studying engineering, and I realized that although they might have been mathematically brilliant, many of them had no clue where the resources for the technologies would come from. And that got me a little worried. So even back then, I realized that perhaps we have a problem with our education system. While geologists were tasked with the purpose of studying the Earth's resources, we had engineers and economists who could behave like they operated in a world of their own, just like many other experts who really don't care about the impacts of their offerings to the world. An example comes to mind here that I want to share with you. Take the example of lithium mining. So lithium is a core component of many technologies, including the batteries in your mobile phones and electric cars. And lithium currently comes from just 4 countries in the world, 2 of which are in Latin America. Lithium also takes up a lot of water for mining, and currently there's a severe water crisis in Latin America because the demand for lithium has gone up and up and up. So this made me wonder, what if engineers were exposed to, say, geography or other disciplines and could have made these connections before it happened and come up with more ingenious solutions to tackle it? Now, years later, I got into climate action myself, and I realized how the advice of climate scientists were ignored for decades by experts and the public. Perhaps because we weren't taught to make these interconnections between the events we see in the world and between disciplines as well early on in school. So perhaps we were all waiting for that extra evidence we could relate to while, we thought most of the events were happening far away. So it was even considered irrational to act in our own immediate realities. So we know now clearly that our actions in one space impact so many others. And clearly one set of skills is no longer relevant to tackling all the very diverse and dynamic challenges we face today, like the climate crisis, for instance. So I thought, what if we could introduce more interdisciplinary thinking into our traditional curricula? What if our young people could take that extra module outside of their core curricula? What if they could explore other domains that were not within their comfort zones or even their direct interests? I believe that when we make collaborative spaces the norm, we also strengthen our critical thinking capacities and our capacities to solve complex problems. Collaborative spaces are also inclusive and diverse, so that provides an opportunity to represent all the voices that are traditionally underrepresented in our education systems. And also, when we take time out to reconnect with others, to rest and to reflect, we strengthen our own self-awareness, so we know what is our own purpose in this world. And I think that's a very core component of educating ourselves. So I think you'll agree with me here when I say that such education also helps us strengthen our soft skills, things like communication, empathy, and active listening, which are hugely valued in the workplace today. I also recently completed a very innovative project with a Portuguese NGO called Girl Move Academy, which aims to train young women like myself for global leadership positions. And my task there was to look for and interview dozens of indigenous leaders from across the world to understand how they, conserve their biodiversity and their ecosystems and their lands. And honestly, these conversations were so refreshing, I even wanted to be born indigenous at some moments. What I learned from them was that indigenous people have a deep respect for nature, and they really value connections within their own communities. I remember an indigenous leader talking about how the kookaburra, which is a bird native to Australia, was actually his grandmother. And we all went, oh. He also spoke about how a young child of 12 practically already has a PhD in ecology and a PhD in astronomy, all by learning from nature when the stars are out and the tide is low, creating this intimate connection with the world around her. And that was so precious to me at the time. So I wondered, why don't we introduce more participatory learning like this with intergenerational dialogues and intercultural dialogues so that knowledge can pass on organically between these communities? How much richer and more meaningful would our education systems be if we allowed this to happen? When I spoke to the Sami people of Norway, I learned how deeply they feel nature at the very core. And I also realized that they can respond almost symbiotically with nature because of their rich vocabulary. Did you know that the Sami people have 300 words just to describe snow and snow conditions? They have a word for fresh snow, a word for old snow, a word for loose snow, just like salt in a salt shaker. Imagine that richness. And I began to wonder, what if we all had an expanded vocabulary, not only in the technical sense, but looking within our emotional selves? We know now that better emotional vocabulary helps us identify and regulate our emotions much better. And as young people, we can have much better mental health and overall well-being. I'll use just one last nugget of wisdom from these indigenous communities to make this last point. Indigenous communities leave space in their lives for mystery, awe, wonder, and a higher being. And this spirituality has helped them preserve over 80% of the world's biodiversity, while they make up only a tiny proportion of the world's population, only 5 to 6%. So that made me wonder, what if we could all leave some space for mystery in our own lives? I believe that we do not, and will never know everything, and that's okay. And perhaps that will make life more meaningful for us. This is not really taught in our education systems. So I eventually progressed into a PhD program, wide-eyed and hopeful that finally I was doing something meaningful with my life. But really all it did was to expose me to the whole world of climate activism and a whole range of voluntary projects, because I was still looking to do something more meaningful with my life. But during this time, I also realized how big the gaps are in our education systems. And coming back to my own discipline for a minute, it was heartbreaking to actually realize that if only economists could have understood that we live on a finite planet, we could have prevented thousands of premature deaths from air pollution, and heck, even prevented the climate emergency we live in today. So I wanted to share a few of these tips and ideas that I had around how we can improve and make our education systems more open, inclusive, diverse, and resilient. And to you, young people, I think many of you are still in university, I would really urge you to take that extra course and go beyond your traditional disciplines, because if you do that, I can guarantee you will not only be intrigued, you will be much better equipped to understand and tackle all the diverse challenges we face in society and in the environment. I am really grateful for all the resources and the mentorship I've received to develop my talk and my thinking around this topic. This is just a word of thanks for that, and to you today for listening to me. Thank you very much.